The crack of gunfire echoed across the plains as Dahlia Byrne dropped to her knees in the center of Silver Creek's dusty Main Street, her wedding gown pooling around her like spilled milk. It wasn't bullets that had brought her down, but words harsh, cutting words from the man who, moments before, was to become her husband. "I won't have a wife who speaks out of turn," Edward Thompson declared, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd of wedding guests who had followed the commotion outside the church. "No man in this territory wants a woman who thinks her opinions matter more than his." Dahlia's offense had been simple. She had dared to question the minister's sermon about a wife's duty to remain silent and submissive. Now, as the April sun of 1876 beat down on her shoulders, she watched her future crumble before her eyes. "Then you won't have me at all," Dahlia said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. At 22, she had already learned that the world had little patience for women with minds of their own, but she hadn't expected this public humiliation on what should have been the happiest day of her life. The wedding guests murmured among themselves. Some women looked at her with pity, others with disdain. The men mostly wore expressions of uncomfortable agreement with Edward's position. No one stepped forward to help her up. No one except the stranger leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon across the street. "Seems to me," the man called out in a voice that carried like thunder across a valley, "that a woman with something to say is worth more than all the silent, nodding dolls in the territory." Heads turned. Edward's face flushed crimson with anger. "Keep your nose out of other men's business, cowboy." The stranger straightened, and Dahlia got her first good look at him, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea. He wore simple clothes, dusty from the trail, and a worn Stetson that shadowed his features. "When a man throws away a treasure in the middle of the street," he replied, walking unhurriedly toward them, "it becomes everybody's business." He reached Dahlia and extended a calloused hand. "Name's Kieran Knox. And I'd say any man fool enough to cast aside a woman for having a voice doesn't deserve to hear it in the first place." Dahlia hesitated only a moment before placing her trembling hand in his. As he helped her to her feet, she felt something pass between them, an understanding, perhaps, or something deeper she couldn't yet name. "You're making a mistake, Dahlia," Edward warned, straightening his tailored suit jacket. "No one else in Silver Creek will have you now." Kieran's eyes never left Dahlia's face. "Then perhaps it's time for new horizons, madam." That was the moment Dahlia Byrne's life changed forever, standing in a dirt street in a ruined wedding dress, her hand in a stranger's, facing a choice between the safety of conformity and the dangerous promise of freedom. "I believe I've had enough of Silver Creek for one day," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Then, in a lower voice meant only for Kieran, she asked, "Where exactly might these new horizons be, Mr. Knox?" His smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "West, Miss Byrne. Always west." Within an hour, Dahlia had changed out of her wedding dress and packed her few belongings. Her parents had refused to speak to her father's silence a wall of disapproval, her mother's tears a river of disappointment. She left them a letter explaining that she couldn't live a life where her thoughts were considered less valuable than her obedience. Kieran waited for her at the edge of town, holding the reins of 2 horses, his sturdy buckskin gelding, and a smaller bay mare he'd purchased from the livery. "You didn't have to buy me a horse," Dahlia said, approaching with her carpet bag. "Didn't buy it for you," Kieran replied with a hint of a smile. "Bought it for me. Just happens I don't need 2 horses, so you're welcome to borrow this one until you figure out where you're headed." Dahlia studied him carefully. "And where are you headed, Mr. Knox?" "Got a small ranch about 4 days' ride from here. Nothing fancy, just enough land to raise some cattle and horses. Was in town delivering some stock when I happened upon your celebration." "That's generous of you to offer help, but I wouldn't want to impose." Kieran helped secure her bag to the saddle. "No imposition. Ranch has a separate cabin for hands. It's empty now. Last fellow moved on to California. You can stay there until you decide your next move." Dahlia hesitated. She barely knew this man, and following him to an isolated ranch could be dangerous. Yet something in his steady gaze reassured her. He hadn't tried to touch her beyond helping her up in the street. He kept a respectful distance now. "Why would you help me?" she asked plainly. "Because what that man did back there wasn't right," Kieran answered, his voice low and serious. And because he paused, seeming to search for the right words. Because sometimes a person needs a chance to find their way without the whole world telling them which path to take. Dahlia considered her options. She had some money saved, but not enough to start a new life elsewhere. She had no family outside of Silver Creek, no friends who would dare defy convention to help her. "I can work," she said finally. "I'm not afraid of hard labor. I can cook, clean, mend. I'm a quick learner for anything else." Kieran nodded. "Could use the help. Been managing alone since my last hand left." "Then we have an arrangement, Mr. Knox. I work for my keep until I've saved enough to move on." They shook hands on it. A business transaction between equals, something Dahlia had rarely experienced with a man. "One more thing," Kieran said as he mounted his horse. "Out there, it's just Kieran. Mr. Knox makes me feel like my father." Dahlia swung herself into the saddle with practiced ease that seemed to surprise him. "Very well, Kieran. And I'm Dahlia." They rode out of Silver Creek as the sun began its westward descent, casting long shadows before them. Dahlia didn't look back at the town that had been her home for all her 22 years. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the vast expanse of prairie and distant mountains, land that promised both hardship and possibility. "Can I ask what you said?" Kieran broke the silence after they'd been riding for an hour. "Back in the church, I mean. What was so terrible that your groom cast you aside?" Dahlia laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The minister spoke about a wife's duties: submission, silence, servitude. When he asked if anyone had questions before proceeding with the vows, I said I did. I asked if a husband had equal duties: to listen to his wife's counsel, to value her mind as well as her hands and body." Kieran whistled low. "And that was enough?" "That was enough," Dahlia confirmed. "Edward said I had embarrassed him, that I'd shown disrespect to the church and to him. He said no decent man would want a wife who questioned God's natural order." They rode in silence for a few more minutes before Kieran spoke again. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. Smartest person I ever knew. Dad used to say her mind was the reason he fell in love with her, said any fool could find a pretty face, but a woman with thoughts worth listening to was rare as gold." Dahlia felt something loosen in her chest. "They sound like unusual people." They were. Lost them both to influenza 10 years ago. "I'm sorry." Kieran shrugged. "Been on my own since I was 18. They left me the ranch and the good sense to know that people who try to silence others are usually afraid of what they might hear." As they made camp that first night under a canopy of stars, Dahlia realized how truly alone she was, and yet, somehow, not lonely. Kieran kept a respectful distance, sleeping on the opposite side of the small fire. They talked easily about practical matters: the route ahead, the weather, the habits of the horses. What Dahlia noticed most was that Kieran asked questions and then truly listened to her answers. He didn't interrupt or dismiss her observations. When she mentioned that the bay mare seemed to favor her left front hoof slightly, he examined the horse immediately, finding a small stone that had worked its way into the shoe. "Good eye," he said simply, and the approval in his voice warmed her more than the fire. The 4-day journey to Kieran's ranch passed without incident. They settled into a comfortable rhythm, rising at dawn, riding until midday, resting through the worst heat, then continuing until dusk. Kieran taught Dahlia how to build a fire that would last through the night, how to read the land for signs of water, how to spot a storm brewing on the horizon before the clouds were visible. In return, Dahlia shared her knowledge of plants: which wild herbs could season their bland trail food, which berries were safe to eat, which leaves could soothe insect bites. Her grandmother had been a healer of sorts, passing down knowledge that Dahlia had absorbed eagerly, another transgression in a town that viewed such women's wisdom with suspicion. On the morning of the 4th day, they crested a gentle rise, and Kieran reined his horse to a stop. "There it is," he said, gesturing toward the valley below. "Knox Ranch." It was modest but well-maintained, a main house built of sturdy logs, a barn, corrals, and the smaller cabin he'd mentioned about 100 yards from the main house. A creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwoods and willows. In the distance, a small herd of cattle grazed on the spring grass. "It's beautiful," Dahlia said honestly. "It's home," Kieran replied, a note of pride in his voice. "Not much compared to some of the big spreads, but it's mine, free and clear." They rode down into the valley, and Dahlia felt a strange sense of anticipation mingled with trepidation. This place would be her home for the foreseeable future, a thought both comforting and unsettling. Kieran showed her to the cabin, a simple one-room structure with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. It's not much, but it's weathertight. Privvy's out back. You can draw water from the well between the houses. It's perfect, Dahlia said, meaning it. After the crowded family home she'd shared with her parents and 2 younger sisters, the small cabin felt like a palace of space that was entirely her own. I'll let you get settled, Kieran said, shifting uncomfortably. Come up to the main house for supper when you're ready. We can talk about your duties then. Alone in the cabin, Dahlia unpacked her few possessions, 2 dresses besides the one she wore, undergarments, a hairbrush, a small mirror, a Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, and a book of poetry she'd hidden from her father, who considered such reading frivolous for women. She washed in the basin, changed into her cleanest dress, and braided her dark hair neatly. Looking in the small mirror, she hardly recognized herself. For days on the trail had brought color to her cheeks and a steadiness to her gaze that hadn't been there before. When she walked to the main house, she found Kieran at the stove, stirring something that smelled surprisingly good. Hope you like stew, he said without turning around. It's one of the few things I can cook without burning. It smells wonderful. Dahlia hovered uncertainly in the doorway. Come in, Kieran said, finally looking up. Something flickered in his eyes when he saw her surprise, perhaps, at seeing her cleaned up and in a fresh dress. You can set the table if you like. Plates are in that cupboard. The domesticity of the moment struck Dahlia as they sat across from each other at the rough-hewn table. This was nothing like the proper, strained meals at her parents' house, where her father dominated the conversation and the women ate in deferential silence. So, Kieran said after they'd eaten in comfortable silence for a few minutes, about your work here. The cabin's yours for as long as you want it. In exchange, I could use help with cooking, mending, tending the kitchen garden. It's gone wild since I haven't had time for it. The cleaning, too, if you're willing. This place could use a woman's touch. He flushed slightly at his own words. I mean, I understand, Dahlia said, smiling. And I'm happy to help with all of that. But I'd like to learn other things too. About the cattle, the horses. I want to earn my keep fully. Kieran studied her for a moment. It's hard work. I'm not afraid of hard work. I'm afraid of being limited. A slow smile spread across his face. Fair enough. We'll start tomorrow. The next weeks fell into a pattern. Dahlia rose early to prepare breakfast, then joined Kieran for the morning's ranch work, mending fences, checking on the cattle, exercising the horses. In the afternoons, she tended to the neglected garden, coaxed it back to life, and prepared the evening meal. After supper, they often sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset and talking. Kieran, she discovered, was a man of depth and contradiction. He'd had only basic schooling but was well-read, with books filling the shelves of his home. He was capable of gentleness when treating an injured calf, but unyielding when dealing with the occasional troublesome drifter who passed through his land. He respected her boundaries absolutely, but watched her sometimes with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. One evening, about a month after her arrival, they sat on the porch as a summer storm rolled in from the mountains. The air was heavy with electricity, the sky darkening dramatically to the west. Storm's coming, Kieran observed unnecessarily. Might be a bad one. Dahlia nodded, watching the distant lightning illuminate the clouds. I've always loved storms. The power of them, the way they change everything they touch. Most women I've known are afraid of them. I'm not most women. Kieran's laugh was soft in the gathering darkness. No, you certainly are not, Dahlia Byrne. The way he said her name sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling air. She glanced at him and found him watching her, his expression unreadable in the dimming light. I should get back to the cabin before the rain starts, she said, suddenly feeling the need for distance. You could stay, Kieran said, then quickly added, in the spare room. If the storm gets bad, that cabin roof might leak. Dahlia hesitated. She'd never entered the second bedroom of the main house, respecting it as Kieran's private space. Thank you, but I'll be fine, she said finally. The cabin's weathertight, remember? Your words. He nodded, not pressing the issue. Just come back here if it gets too rough. Dahlia hurried to her cabin as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Inside, she lit the lamp and listened to the rain intensify, pounding on the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. The storm unleashed its fury, wind howling around the eaves, thunder cracking overhead, lightning illuminating the small room in brilliant flashes. She was just beginning to worry about the roof's integrity when a particularly violent gust of wind tore through the valley. Something large cracked outside, and before Dahlia could react, a tremendous crash shook the cabin. The roof partially collapsed as a massive tree limb punctured it, sending splintered wood and torrents of rain into the room. Dahlia screamed and leaped from the bed, grabbing her shawl and the lamp. She ran for the door, flinging it open only to be confronted by the full force of the storm. The rain instantly doused her lamp, leaving her in darkness broken only by lightning flashes. Dahlia, Kieran's voice barely carried over the storm's roar. She saw his silhouette running toward her, a lantern held high. The roof collapsed, she shouted as he reached her. Without hesitation, Kieran wrapped his free arm around her shoulders and guided her toward the main house. They struggled against the wind, arriving on the porch soaked to the skin and breathless. Inside, Kieran set down the lantern and turned to look at her. "Are you hurt?" "No, just wet and frightened," Dahlia answered, suddenly aware of how her soaked dress clung to her body. She crossed her arms over her chest. "Let me get you something dry to wear," Kieran said, averting his eyes. He disappeared into his bedroom, returning with a clean shirt and a pair of trousers that would be far too large for her. "It's all I have. You can change in the spare room." The room was simply furnished but comfortable, a bed with a patchwork quilt, a small dresser, a rocking chair by the window. Dahlia changed quickly, rolling up the sleeves and trouser legs. The clothes smelled of soap and something uniquely Kieran, a scent that was becoming dangerously familiar. When she emerged, Kieran had stoked the fire and was setting a kettle to boil. He'd changed as well, into a dry shirt that stretched across his shoulders as he leaned over the stove. "Feel better?" he asked, glancing up. "Much. Thank you." She sat in a chair by the fire, extending her bare feet toward the warmth. "I'm sorry about the cabin." "Don't be. It was the old cottonwood by the creek. I've been meaning to trim those branches for months." He poured hot water into 2 mugs, adding dried mint leaves to each. "We'll fix the roof once the storm passes." He handed her a mug, his fingers brushing hers. "Unless you've decided to move on." Dahlia took a sip of the mint tea, considering her answer. The truth was, she hadn't thought about moving on for weeks. The ranch had begun to feel like home, and Kieran had become someone she couldn't imagine leaving. "I haven't decided anything," she said finally. Kieran nodded, settling into the chair opposite hers. "You're welcome here as long as you want to stay, Dahlia. I hope you know that." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, a different kind of tension built between them, unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings that had been growing since that first day in Silver Creek. "Why did you really help me that day?" Dahlia asked suddenly. "The truth, Kieran." He stared into his mug for a long moment before meeting her eyes. "Because when you stood up in that church and questioned what everyone took for granted, it was the bravest thing I'd ever seen. And when that fool cast you aside for it." He shook his head. "I couldn't bear to watch someone be punished for having the courage I've always admired." "Is that all?" Dahlia pressed, her heart beating faster. Kieran set his mug down carefully. "No," he admitted. "That's not all. But I won't speak of the rest unless you want to hear it." "I want to hear it." He leaned forward, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "From the moment I saw you in that wedding dress, kneeling in the dirt, but with your head still high, I thought you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Not because of your face, though God knows you're lovely enough, but because of what shone through you, that spirit that wouldn't bend even when everything was against you." Dahlia's breath caught. No man had ever spoken to her like this, as if her mind and spirit were what made her beautiful, not just her appearance. "I wanted to know you," Kieran continued, "to hear what you had to say. I've spent my life surrounded by men who talk just to hear their own voices, who never say anything worth listening to. But I had a feeling that anything you had to say would be worth hearing." "And has it been?" Dahlia whispered. "Worth hearing?" Kieran's eyes never left hers. "Your voice is the one I've been waiting for all my life, Dahlia Byrne. Every word you speak, makes me want to hear 1,000 more. The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Dahlia felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the profound relief of being truly seen. "No one has ever valued my words before," she said. "They've been tolerated at best, silenced at worst. Then everyone before me was a fool." Kieran's voice was rough with emotion. "Because your words are worth more than gold to me." Dahlia moved from her chair to kneel before him, taking his hands in hers. "And yours to me," she said simply. Kieran reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of damp hair from her face. His touch was gentle, reverent. "I don't want to presume." Dahlia leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, silencing his doubts with a kiss that spoke more eloquently than words. His arms came around her, strong but careful, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Kieran pressed his forehead to hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Not as my ranch hand. Not as my cook or housekeeper. Stay because I love listening to you, talking with you, being with you." "Are you asking me to be your wife?" Dahlia pulled back slightly, needing to see his face. "Eventually, yes, if you'll have me. But first, I'm asking you to be my partner. My equal. The woman whose mind I value as much as her heart." Dahlia smiled through tears. "I think I can agree to those terms, Kieran Knox." Outside, the storm began to abate, the thunder moving into the distance, the rain softening to a gentle patter. Inside, Dahlia and Kieran remained by the fire, talking until dawn about dreams and fears, hopes and memories, each word a thread in the tapestry of understanding they were weaving between them. When morning came, bringing clear skies and glistening wet landscape, they stood together on the porch, surveying the damage. The old cottonwood had indeed lost a massive limb that had crashed through the cabin roof, leaving a gaping hole. "We can fix it," Kieran said, his arm around Dahlia's waist. "We will," she agreed. "But I'm thinking perhaps we don't need to rush." He looked down at her, a question in his eyes. "The main house has plenty of room," Dahlia said boldly. "And I find I prefer being closer to you." Kieran's smile was slow and warm. "People will talk when they find out. Let them talk. I've never much cared for other people's opinions on how I should live my life. That," Kieran said, kissing her softly, "is precisely why I love you." The words, spoken in the clear light of morning, carried the weight of truth. Dahlia had been cast aside for speaking her mind, but in doing so, she had found the one man who valued her voice above all others. They began work on the cabin roof that day, but their hearts weren't in the repair. 3 days later, Dahlia moved her few possessions into the main house, not to the spare room, but to Kieran's. They weren't married, yet that would come later, on their own terms, but they were committed to each other in all the ways that mattered. Word spread, as it always does in small communities. The ranch hands Kieran hired for the summer cattle drive raised eyebrows, but said nothing to his face. The wives of neighboring ranchers visited with thinly veiled curiosity, some leaving with pursed lips of disapproval, others with grudging respect for a woman who had forged her own path. Edward Thompson rode out once, 6 months after the wedding that never was. Dahlia was alone, tending the thriving garden that now produced more than enough vegetables for winter storage. "You've made quite a scandal of yourself," he said by way of greeting, remaining mounted on his horse as if afraid to set foot on her territory. Dahlia straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Hello, Edward. What brings you all this way?" "Came to see if the rumors were true that you're living in sin with that cowboy who stole you away." "Kieran didn't steal me. He offered me a choice when you left me with none." Dahlia's voice was calm, her gaze steady. "As for living in sin, I consider it more sinful to silence a person's spirit than to love honestly outside the bounds of convention." Edward's face darkened. "You haven't changed." "No," Dahlia agreed. "I haven't. That was always the problem between us, wasn't it? You wanted me to change, to become someone else. Kieran loves me for who I am." "He won't marry you," Edward said spitefully. "Men like him don't marry women they can get for free." The insult stung, but Dahlia refused to show it. "You know nothing about him. Or me. I know you've ruined yourself. No decent man will have you now." "I already have the only man I want," Dahlia replied. "And unlike you, he thinks my mind is my best quality." Edward had no response to that. He tipped his hat stiffly and rode away, leaving Dahlia shaken but unbowed. When Kieran returned from town that evening and found her unusually quiet, she told him about the encounter. His jaw tightened. "I should have been here. I handled it," Dahlia said. "Though he did make one point that's been troubling me." "What's that?" "He said you wouldn't marry me." Dahlia met his eyes directly. "Is that true?" Kieran stared at her for a moment, then burst out laughing. "Is that what's been worrying you?" He crossed to the dresser and pulled open the top drawer, retrieving a small wooden box. "I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," he said, suddenly serious. "I was planning to ask you on your birthday next week, but since that fool brought it up." He knelt before her, taking her hand. "Dahlia Byrne, will you marry me?" "Not because convention demands it, but because I want to stand before God and everyone and declare that I choose you, your mind, your spirit, your voice, for all my days." Tears spilled down Dahlia's cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Kieran Knox." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if made for her, and pulled her into his arms. "We'll do it however you want," he murmured against her hair. "Big church wedding, small ceremony here at the ranch, just us and a preacher under the cottonwood, whatever will make you happy." Dahlia thought about it, about what kind of wedding would truly reflect who they were together. "The cottonwood," she decided. "The one that brought us together that night. We'll plant a new one beside it, to grow as our love grows." And so, on a perfect autumn day in 1877, with leaves turning gold and red around them, Dahlia and Kieran were married beneath the mended cottonwood. The ceremony was small but meaningful. A few ranch hands, some neighboring families who had come to accept, if not fully approve, of their unconventional beginning, and a circuit-riding preacher who asked no questions about their arrangement before the wedding day. Dahlia wore a simple dress of deep blue rather than traditional white, a deliberate choice that made Kieran smile when he saw her approaching on the path from the house. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises that spoke of partnership and respect, of valuing each other's voices and supporting each other's dreams. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kieran kissed her with a tenderness that belied the passion she knew would come later when they were alone. The small gathering celebrated with a feast Dahlia had prepared, music from a ranch hand's fiddle, and dancing that continued long after the sun had set. As they swayed together under the stars, Kieran whispered in her ear, "Happy." "More than I ever thought possible," Dahlia replied honestly. "When Edward left me kneeling in that street, I thought my life was over. I couldn't have imagined it was just beginning. His loss, my gain." Kieran's arms tightened around her. "Though I suppose, in a way, we should thank him." Dahlia laughed. "I'm not quite that generous." Later, alone in the house that was now truly theirs together, Kieran held her close in their bed. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful in the darkness. Dahlia was almost asleep, content and satiated. "About expanding the ranch. Buying the Douglas property to the west. It's good grazing land, has another water source. We could double our herd in a few years." Dahlia turned to face him, suddenly alert. "That's a big step." "It is, and I wouldn't consider it without knowing what you think." His hand traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "This is our future, not just mine. Your opinion matters to me, Dahlia. It always will." The simple statement, so at odds with everything she had been raised to expect from marriage, filled Dahlia's heart to overflowing. "Let's discuss it in the morning," she said. "I want to hear all the details, the risks, the potential." "We will," Kieran promised, kissing her forehead. "Your voice is the one I need most in all things." The ranch did expand, not just once, but several times over the years that followed. Kieran's business acumen combined with Dahlia's careful planning turned Knox Ranch into one of the most successful operations in the territory. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, market fluctuations, and the changing landscape of the West as railroads and towns expanded ever further into what had once been wilderness. Their family grew too. Their first child, a daughter they named Sarah after Kieran's mother, arrived a year after their wedding, a bright, curious girl who inherited her mother's outspoken nature and her father's steady determination. 2 years later came James, named for Dahlia's grandfather, a quiet, thoughtful boy with a natural affinity for horses. The youngest, Elizabeth, was born 3 years after that, the most adventurous of the three, always the first to climb the highest tree or ride the most spirited pony. They raised their children to value both learning and labor, to respect others, but never to silence themselves for the sake of convention. Dahlia taught them to read and write, to cipher and think critically. Kieran taught them the practical skills of ranch life, how to judge a horse's soundness, how to predict weather from the sky and wind. Most importantly, they taught their children by example that a marriage could be a true partnership, that a man and woman could disagree respectfully, could value each other's opinions even when they differed, could face challenges together as equals. The years weren't without difficulties. When Dahlia was 30, she miscarried what would have been their fourth child, a loss that plunged her into a grief so profound she couldn't speak of it for months. Kieran gave her the space to mourn in her own way, neither pushing her to talk nor allowing her to withdraw completely. He simply remained steadfast, shouldering more of the household duties, ensuring the children were cared for, waiting patiently until she was ready to share her pain. When she finally did speak of it, one cold winter night as they sat before the fire, the words poured out of her: the devastation, the feeling of failure, the irrational but persistent fear that she had somehow caused the loss by being too active, too involved in the ranch work. "I wonder sometimes," she confessed, tears streaming down her face, "if this is punishment for my pride, for thinking I could have everything: a marriage, children, work I love, when women are supposed to choose." "No," Kieran said firmly, taking her hands in his. "This isn't punishment, Dahlia. It's just a terrible, painful thing that happened. Not because you did anything wrong, not because you're being punished. Sometimes life deals cruel blows for no reason at all. How can you be sure? Because I know you. I've watched you love our children, care for this land, build this life with me. Nothing about the way you live deserves punishment." He gathered her into his arms. "You are exactly the woman you're meant to be, Dahlia Knox. And I thank God every day that you are." His unwavering faith in her helped Dahlia find her way back from grief. By spring, though the pain hadn't disappeared, it had eased enough for her to plant a small tree in the corner of the garden, a living memorial to the child they had lost. Life continued. The children grew. The ranch prospered. Silver Creek expanded into a proper town with a school, and Dahlia rode in once a week to teach reading to the children, many of whom came from families where books were scarce. Some of the very women who had once looked at her with disapproval now sought her advice on managing household accounts or treating childhood illnesses. Edward Thompson left the territory after his bank failed in 1883, moving east to start over. Dahlia heard the news with a surprising lack of emotion. He had become a figure from another life, one so distant she could barely recall the panic and humiliation of that wedding day. On their 20th anniversary, Kieran surprised Dahlia with a journey 2 months traveling to San Francisco, a city she had always wanted to see. They left the ranch in the capable hands of Sarah, now 19, and as competent a manager as either of her parents, and James, 17, and already showing signs of the horseman he would become. The trip was a revelation: the vastness of the ocean, the bustling energy of the city, the diversity of people and ideas they encountered. They attended the theater, visited museums, walked for hours along the waterfront watching ships come and go from ports around the world. "It's amazing," Dahlia said one evening as they sat on the balcony of their hotel room, watching the sun set over the bay. "To think of all the different lives being lived, all the different voices being heard." Kieran took her hand, his thumb brushing over the simple gold band he'd placed there 2 decades before. "Do you ever regret it? The life we've chosen?" Dahlia looked at him, this man who had grown older alongside her, whose face now showed lines of laughter and concern, whose hair was threaded with silver, but whose eyes still held the same steady warmth they had when he'd helped her up from the dirt in Silver Creek. "Never," she said with complete conviction. "Not for a single moment. Even when it was hard. When we lost the baby, when we nearly lost the ranch in '79. Especially then," Dahlia said, "because those were the times when I most needed to be heard, to be valued, and you never failed me, Kieran. Not once in 20 years have you asked me to be less than who I am." He brought her hand to his lips. "How could I? Your voice is what I fell in love with first, that courage to speak truth even when no one wanted to hear it. Everything I am, everything we've built together, began with you refusing to be silenced." They returned to the ranch renewed, carrying memories of the wider world, but content with the life they had created together. The years that followed brought new challenges and joys, their children marrying, grandchildren arriving, the gradual transition of ranch responsibilities to the next generation. By the time Dahlia and Kieran reached their 60s, Knox Ranch had grown to encompass thousands of acres, with Sarah and her husband managing the cattle operation, James running a successful horse breeding program, and Elizabeth, who had inherited her mother's healing knowledge, serving as the region's most respected midwife and herbalist. On warm evenings, Dahlia and Kieran still sat together on the porch of the main house, now expanded and improved, but still recognizably the home where they had begun their life together. Sometimes they spoke of the past, of how far they had come from that fateful day in Silver Creek. Other times they discussed the future, the changing West, the new century approaching, the lives their grandchildren might lead in a world transforming more rapidly than anyone could have imagined. Most often, though, they simply enjoyed the comfortable silence that can exist only between two people who have truly heard each other for a lifetime, a silence rich with understanding, respect, and abiding love. On their 50th anniversary, with family gathered from near and far to celebrate, Kieran stood to offer a toast. Age had bent his once straight frame slightly, and his hands showed the effects of decades of hard work, but his voice remained strong and clear. 50 years ago, he began, I witnessed something remarkable, a woman who refused to be silenced, even when it cost her everything she thought she wanted. He looked at Dahlia, his eyes full of the same admiration they had held when he first saw her. What she couldn't know then was that in losing what she thought she wanted, she would find what she truly needed, and in doing so, give me the greatest gift of my life. He raised his glass. To Dahlia, whose voice has been my guide, my comfort, and my joy for half a century. The most beautiful sound in my world. Dahlia rose to stand beside him, taking his weathered hand in hers. And to Kieran, who heard me when no one else would listen, who taught me that speaking my mind wasn't a flaw to be corrected, but a strength to be cherished. Their glasses touched, a crystal chime that seemed to echo through the decades of their shared life, a sound as clear and true as the voice that had brought them together on a dusty street in Silver Creek all those years ago. In the spring of 1926, at the age of 72, Dahlia sat beneath the massive cottonwood tree, the one that had crashed through the cabin roof during that long-ago storm, now healed and thriving alongside the younger tree they had planted on their wedding day. Her great-grandchildren played nearby, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Kieran lowered himself carefully beside her on the bench they had placed there years before. At 74, his movements were slower now, but his eyes were as bright as ever when they looked at her. "What are you thinking about, love?" he asked, taking her hand in his as he had done countless times over their 50 years together. Dahlia smiled, watching the children, the fourth generation of Knoxes, to grow up on this land. "I was thinking about voices," she said, "about how one moment of speaking up changed everything." Kieran nodded, understanding as he always did. "If you hadn't questioned that minister, or if you hadn't spoken up from that hitching post, then we would have missed everything," Kieran finished. All of this, he gestured to the thriving ranch, the children, the life they had built together, might never have been. Dahlia leaned against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that of all the choices she had made in her long life, finding the courage to speak her mind that day in Silver Creek had been the most important, and that finding the man who valued her voice above all others had been her greatest blessing. "I love you, Kieran Knox," she said simply, words she had spoken thousands of times, but that never lost their meaning. "And I love you, Dahlia Knox," he replied, his voice still carrying the echo of the young cowboy who had once declared her voice the one he needed most. Every word, every thought, every dream. Together they watched the sun begin its westward descent, casting long shadows before them just as it had that first day they rode out of Silver Creek, toward a future neither could have imagined but that they had created, word by word, day by day, through the power of speaking and being heard.